Turin, Italy, January 1889. A man walks through the narrow city streets, his eyes sunken, his thick mustache trembling in the cold wind. He carries with him the weight of having murdered God, of having shattered all the moral certainties of the West, of having gazed into the abyss until the abyss decided to gaze back. Suddenly, he stops. In Piazza Carlo Alberto, a coachman beats an old horse. The animal groans, bleeds, and falls. And then ... The philosopher collapses. He embraces the horse's neck. He cries, he screams, and he is never the same again. Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who challenged all of humanity to surpass itself, had just gone mad. Grab your whiskey as we delve deeper into the subject. The genius who went too far and went mad. If you've made it this far, it's no coincidence. You're looking for something beyond easy answers, so sign up, but only if you're ready to face truths that most prefer to ignore. Nietzsche once wrote, "Whoever fights with monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." Now, tell me, how far would you go in search of the truth? Before becoming a ghost of himself, Nietzsche was a prodigy. At 24 years old, he was already a professor of classical philology at the University of Bâle. While you're still deciding what to do with your life, this guy already mastered ancient Greek and Latin, and discussed the foundations of Western civilization with frightening clarity. But geniuses pay a price, they always do. From a young age, Nietzsche suffered from migraines that left him blind with pain for days. Constant vomiting, insomnia, vision problems so severe that he could barely read his own manuscript. And yet, he wrote as if time were running out, because, deep down, he knew it was. Loneliness was also consuming him. He broke with Wagner, his intellectual idol. He lost friends. He was rejected by Lou Salome, perhaps the only real love he ever had. With each book published, he became more isolated, because nobody wants to be friends with someone who dismantles everything you believe in. He had no followers. He had no disciples. He Haji Nuhuan. Just him, his pain, and the ideas that nobody wanted to hear. And you know what's worse? How You Knew How was misunderstood. He wrote for a future that might never come. He said, "I was born posthumously," as if he were already dead before he died. Imagine the loneliness of carrying truths that shatter foundations, knowing that absolutely no one is ready to hear them. Because Nietzsche didn't philosophize to comfort. He philosophized to wake up, and waking up hurts. Then he continued, alone, sick, obsessed, until something inside him began to crack. Would you have endured it? Would you have continued writing knowing that no one would listen to you? Or would you have given up, returning to the comfort of collective lies? Think about it. Because the abyss was already there, waiting. Now, take a deep breath, because this is where things get really dark. Nietzsche didn't go mad by accident. He went mad because ... he chose to look at places where most people prefer to close their eyes. You know that feeling when you realize an uncomfortable truth about yourself, your family, or society, and your brain immediately tries to distract you. Better not think about that now, ... It's humanity's oldest psychological defense mechanism, strategic denial. Nietzsche didn't have that luxury, or rather, he refused that's luxury. He decided to kill God. Not the God of heaven, with the white beard and miracles, but the God of absolute moral foundation, the idea that there is a cosmic meaning, a divine order, a greater purpose that protects us from chaos. And when you kill God ... what's left? Nothing, absolute emptiness. No prefabricated meaning, no instruction manual, no reward after death. Just you, your finite existence, and the terrifying responsibility of creating your own values in an indifferent universe. Most people can't handle that, because nothing is more frightening than total freedom. So they create new gods, political ideologies, consumerism, social media likes, automatic routines, anything to avoid facing the emptiness. Because emptiness doesn't forgive. It doesn't console you. It simply ... And But Nietzsche, he dove right in. He wrote about the Bermensch, the human being who creates its own values without needing metaphysical crutches. He preached eternal return, the idea that you should live as if each moment were repeating itself infinitely. He destroyed Christian morality, calling it slave morality that denies life in the name of an imaginary paradise. And do you know what happens when you do that publicly in 19th century conservative Christian Europe? You'll be left alone, completely, irremediably, existentially alone. Because nobody wants to share a table with someone who has just dynamited the foundations of civilization. Nobody wants to drink wine with someone who says, everything you believe is a comfortable lie. Nietzsche carried that weight alone for years. And the human brain wasn't made to endure this existential loneliness for very long, because we are social animals. We need human mirrors to confirm our sanity. We need someone to say, yes, I also see what you see. But when you see what no one else sees, when you think what no one else dares to think, ... who's holding you back? Nietzsche wrote, and those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. But what if the music is so loud, so dissonant, so deafening, that even you can no longer distinguish whether it's real or a hallucination? He was dancing alone on the edge of the abyss. And the abyss began to whisper back. Would you have kept dancing, or would he have run back to the comfort of collective illusions? Because his next step was literal collapse. January 3rd, 1889, the date on which the most lucid philosopher in history completely lost his mind. Nietzsche was living in Turin, Italy, a calm, beautiful city, far removed from the chaos seething inside his head. He walked the streets every day, observing the people, writing increasingly strange, increasingly intense letters. In the preceding months, he had written at a frantic, almost possessed pace. Behold the Man, the Antichrist, Twilight of the Idol's entire books in a matter of weeks, as if he knew time was running out, as if he were racing against an invisible clock that only he could hear. And then, on that January morning, it happened. In piazza, Carlo Alberto Nietzsche saw a coachman beating an old horse. The animal was exhausted, bleeding, and groaning in pain. And something within the philosopher, ... It broke. He ran to the horse. He hugged the animal's neck. He began to cry, to sob, to scream. Then he fainted. When he woke up, he was no longer Nietzsche. He was something else, something fragmented, something lost. He began writing letters, delirious letters, signed a cyanosis, Earth crucified one Altus to Wagner, who died years ago, to the King of Italy, and to Cosima Wagner. In one of them, he wrote, I would rather be a professor at Basel than God, but I did not dare to take my private egoism so far as to renounce the creation of the world. In another, I ordered Bismarck and Wilhelm to be shot. I asked that you arrive in Turin before noon. Bring appropriate clothing, Dionysius. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a metaphor. It was madness. His friend Franz Overbeck traveled to Turin immediately. When he arrived, he found Nietzsche in a catatonic state, alternating between profound silences and bursts of screams. He played the piano compulsively, but meaninglessly, just making noise. He sang. He laughed. He cried. The man who had written, What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. She was dying inside while her body insisted on continuing to breathe. The doctors diagnosed progressive paralysis, probably tertiary syphilis, the same disease that destroyed brilliant minds like Baudelaire's. Others speculate brain tumor, nervous breakdown, manic depressive psychosis. The truth, nobody knows perhaps, it was syphilis. Perhaps it was the weight of carrying humanity's heaviest truths alone. Perhaps it was the abyss finally staring back with such intensity that it incinerated his mind. Or perhaps, and this is the most terrifying hypothesis of Wassel of this together, the body decaying, the mind isolated, the soul exhausted from so much thinking, so much seeing, so much to know. Because there is a limit, there is always a limit. And Nietzsche surpassed him. The cruelest irony, the scene with the horse, this man who preached strength, the will to power, the overcoming of weakness broke down upon seeing the suffering of an animal. As if, in the end, beneath all the layers of radical philosophy, there was still a human heart beating, fragile, compassionate, incapable of enduring any more pain, He was taken back to Germany, hospitalized, medicated, silenced. The philosopher who had challenged the entire world could now barely form a coherent sentence. And the worst was yet to come, because dying wouldn't be the end. It would only be the beginning of an agony that would last 0.11 years. Have you ever stopped to think about what's worse? Dying quickly or rotting slowly while everyone watches? Nietzsche had no choice. He experienced both. From 1889 to 1900, 11 years. 11 years of Nuthin. Imagine you are a genius. You think more deeply than anyone around you. You write books that will change philosophy forever. You are revivoing the most intense sense of the word. And then, suddenly, you pass out. It doesn't die. It just turns off. The body continues. The heart beats. The lungs breathe. But the mind, that brilliant, unsettling, revolutionary mind, is gone. And you're left there, trapped, a ghost within your own flesh. That's what happened to Nietzsche. After collapsing in Turin, he was taken back to Germany. First, he was placed under the care of his mother, a devout, conservative Christian woman. Everything her son had spent his life criticizing. The irony is almost too literary to be real. The man who proclaimed the death of God now needed a pious woman to wipe away his saliva, change his clothes, and feed him. He no longer spoke. He only mumbled meaningless sounds. Sometimes he screamed. Other times, he would remain in absolute silence for hours, staring into nothingness. The philosopher who wrote about the will to power now had no will at all. Not even the will to live or die. He simply existed, like a plant, like a stone, and you know what's worse? He was conscious, at least in the early years. There are reports that he still recognized some people. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he cried when he heard music, as if a tiny part of him was still inside, trapped, watching his own decay without being able to do anything. In 1897, her mother died. And who took over her care? Elizabeth Ifi, Histenia Shishi, the sister, the manipulator, the opportunist. Elizabeth was everything Nietzsche despised: nationalist, anti-Semitic, married to a racist colonist in Paraguay. They had argued for years. He called her vengeful a man the letters. But now he could no longer defend himself. And she took advantage of it. Elizabeth took control of his manuscripts, edited his works, and distorted his ideas to serve Nazi propaganda decades later. She transformed the philosopher who criticized German nationalism into ... philosophical idol of the Third Reich. And Nietzsche, he was there sitting, drooling, unable to shout, "No, you're all misunderstanding." The tragedy was not just physical, it was existential, because while he rotted away in silence, his books finally began to be read. Finally, people paid attention. Finally, he became ... famous, Batulache. He spent his entire life being ignored, rejected, misunderstood, and when the world finally turned its eyes to him, he was no longer there to see it. It's as if the universe played a bad joke on them. Did you want to be heard, Nietzsche? Here is your audience, but you can no longer speak. He lived, if we can even call that life, in a vegetative state. Force-fed, taken out to sunbathe like a decorative object. The man who wrote thus spoke Zarathustra now. It only emitted moans. The man who preached self-improvement now needed someone to clean him up after getting himself dirty. The man who said, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." It was slowly dying, and it wasn't getting stronger. It was just ... fading away. And then, on August 25th, 1900, finally ... he finished pneumonia. The frail, exhausted body gave up. Friedrich Nietzsche died at the age of 55, but in truth he had already been dead for 11 years. The question that remains is, what is worse? To die young at the peak of lucidity, or to live long enough to become an empty shell of what you once were? Nietzsche experienced both. And that, my dear viewer, is not philosophy. It's awful. Now we come to the question that nobody wants to ask, but that everyone thinks about in silence. Did Nietzsche go mad because he thought too much? Or despite thinking too much? Because this distinction matters. It matters very if you went mad because of syphilis, a brain tumor, some physical illness. Then the madness was just bad luck, a biological accident. Tragic, but disconnected from his philosophy. But what if it wasn't? What if madness was Theproseph going too far, of looking too deep, of thinking without breaks, without protections, without the comforting illusions that keep most of us functioning? Think about it. Nietzsche destroyed all foundations. God, morality, meaning, purpose. He lived in an absolute void that he himself created, and he had no one to share that burden with. No master, no disciple, no close friend who truly understood him. He was alone in the abyss. And the abyss is a dangerous place to stay for long, because the human brain was not designed to withstand total absence of meaning. We are machines for creating narratives, for finding patterns, for clinging to stories that tell us it's okay, there's a purpose. You matter. Nietzsche drew this from himself, voluntarily. And what happens when you remove all the psychological anchors? You float, and floating in the void for long enough can make you lose touch with anything that resembles shared reality. So perhaps Nietzsche's madness wasn't merely an illness. Perhaps it was, inevitable collapse from a mind that went beyond what the human structure can withstand. Like a diver who goes too deep without equipment. The pressure simply crushes them. And here's the most disturbing part. Does this mean there's a limit to lucidity? Are there truths that, if seen with complete clarity, would destroy the sanity of those who see them? Because most people live with layers of denial. I'm going to die, but not today. Life is meaningless. But I'll pretend it is. Nothing matters in the end, but I'll still get out of bed tomorrow. These layers, era necessareti, are what allow us to function. What prevents us from collapsing every time we look into the void? Nietzsche peeled away all those layers, one by one, until he stood naked before the abyss. And the abyss devoured him. Now, the big question, does this make him a martyr for truth or an example of someone who is too reckless? You could argue he was brave. He saw what no one else dared to see. Or you could argue he was reckless. Some limits exist for a reason, and they would both be right. Because Nietzsche left us something valuable, a life-affirming philosophy, of creating values, of overcoming challenges, ideas that still resonate more than a century later. But he also left us a warning. Be careful not to look too deep, because you might not be able to come back. He paid the highest possible price for lucidity. 11 years of emptiness. A decade rotting away while the world finally read his words. And here is the final irony, the cruelest of all. Nietzsche wrote, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find meaning in suffering." But in the end, he found no meaning. He only suffered. So what do we do with this? Have we given up on deep thinking to avoid going insane? Or do we continue staring into the abyss, knowing we may not return, but believing it's worth it? And you? How far would you go? Would you have the courage to destroy all your certainties? To live without metaphysical solace? To dance alone on the edge of the precipice? Or do you, like most of us, prefer a controlled dose of lucidity enough to feel awake, but not so much that it destroys you? Because Nietzsche went all the way and the end destroyed him. But perhaps he left a map, not of how to reach the abyss, but offering not to step. Or maybe not. Maybe he just showed us that some paths have no turning back. Take a deep breath. Think about it. So decide, do you want to be sensible or do you want to be free? Because as Nietzsche proved, sometimes you can't have both. Empty whiskey, fill your glass, the next abyss awaits you. Sign up.